appears to be working. I'll drag myself into a position here where, oh yeah, I'm shot. New haircut's working well. Anyway, this is me, Dr. Michael Meaney, nominally of the University of Newcastle, School of Humanities, Creative Industries and Social Sciences. As, boy, we've been trying to come up with a good pronouncement of what that acronym is. We end up with HKIS, which seems to be some kind of funky team for something, I'm not sure what. But we're desperate to try and give this collection of words some holistic meaning that would just be obvious at first glance to everyone out there. And that's a hopeless, hopeless task. But we try it anyway. Okay. I do want to do an acknowledgement of country. We recognise that Indigenous Australians have an ongoing connection to the land, and the university values their unique contribution, both to the university and the wider Australian society. La Trobe University has multiple campuses. Like the University of Newcastle, multiple campuses, each of which are occupying other people's lands. And I would like to express and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I will just dive into this. This is a largely speaking theoretical type presentation. And there was so much of Tom's presentation that rang bells with me. Oh, yeah. All the way down to, how does a poet know they're being a poet? The whole idea that somebody might improvise something reminded me of the great creativity theoretician called Keith Sawyer. I was lucky enough to have breakfast with him one morning, where he retold a story that was he had published in his book on creativity, which said that as a young man, he would be playing blues at improv clubs as a way of making money to support himself. And that certain nights, he would suddenly realise he'd been asleep. He actually slept through the improv moment. And no one had noticed. And you think, okay, now this is either a comment on how good his improv was at best, or indeed what improv is. And I think Tom is absolutely spot on when he says there are structures, there are forms, there's format, there are functions that these moments of expression need to include. And if your improvised performance can pick up on them, then they may not be new to you. In fact, they may be so unnew to you that you can do them while you sleep. But for the audience out there, they'll go, I've never heard it done quite that way before. And that was Keith Sawyer's point about improvisation. Okay. It also leads as a nice little segue into this moment of oscillation, which brings into account all of those moments of, thoughts of authenticity. Why is it that an Australian country music singer feels the need to sing in an American accent to sound authentic? There you go. But we have these old Australian singers who sung in the worst of Australian accents, and they sort of sounded authentic. Yes, but it's much better to be authentic in terms of something that will be understandable by Nashville. than something that is understandable in Tamil. That's just dollars and cents forcing their way into our sense of what is authentic. Okay. So many of the theories that we have and we will propose depend on some kind of oscillation. The difference between the telic and paratelic experience, Michael Apter's work in psychology. Most people in their workaday world live in this telic kind of state where the world is a serious, it's a serious undertaking and there are serious jobs to be done. That's purely telic. The paratelic is much more playful. And if you try to swap somebody out of a telic state into a paratelic state at exactly the wrong time, you will not be met with raucous laughter. You will be met with howls of "Don't do that, stop it, go away, I'm working here, I've got serious job to do." And your attempt at playfulness is really unwanted. So they're the two extremes in Michael Apter's view, or the reversal theory of humour that says that humour, when it works, and once again I'm using humour rather than comedy here, that humour, when it works, successfully swaps people from telic to paratelic state, yes, and oscillates between those two and gets people to consider the really, in many ways, what is the madness of that telic work-driven state. And then what is the facetious in the paratelic state. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. For a long time, people believed that creative work always came out of intrinsic forms of motivation, that you couldn't be paid to be creative. Guess what? You can be. And I say that now in this room, it got a round of wry laughter, and you go, yeah, that's right, that's appropriate. You can actually be paid to be creative. The Brill Building, amongst others, amongst all sorts of other examples, prime cases of you just get enough creative people like monkeys, pay them enough, put them in a room together and tell them to be creative, and they will start the world's most dire competition to be more creative than the person sitting next to them. And that's really sort of weird, because we tend not, once again, we tend not to think of creativity as being a competition sport, particularly not being a full body contact sport. But it seems that, unfortunately, it is. Once again, the idea of extrinsic motivation was at one stage considered to be the complete anathema to creativity. Yeah. There are a surprising number of our students who will tell us that anybody who puts on a mantle of authenticity is being a sellout and therefore not being creative. They are just being peddlers of existing forms, tropes, structures that they believe would work. And that somehow or other that's not authentic, and therefore it's not truly creative. Schrodinger's cat, dead or alive. This too is an oscillation. At this moment in time, my university, for example, doesn't know which I am. Just a bit of a problem. Yeah. In September last year, I had a stroke of some variety, a weird little character running around in my brainstem. The university is now going, so is he with us or is he not with us? And so that's right. I partially exist on their payroll, but I don't exist on their website anymore. So am I dead or alive? Am I just oscillating between these 2 points? Okay. Now I'm going to dive into a really technobabble piece of oscillation, because it does tell us something strange about the way that we like to deal with the world. Why do we do it? Why does PAL, our normal television, run at 25 frames per second, where the American standard NTSC uses 30 frames per second? And I'm fiddling there a bit. It actually uses 29.98 frames per second. Why do they do that? It's actually because every television frame that we see is made up of 2 fields, sometimes called an upper and a lower field, and positive and negative and all sorts of other names for them. So for each one of these frame rates, we double them to have the field rates. And the field rates are, therefore, 50 times per second for PAL and 60 times per second for NTSC. And all of this comes down to how fast a turbine spins in a power plant. That's what it's all based on. So in the States, a turbine in a power plant spins at 3,600 RPM, which comes down to a nice, neat 60 revolutions per second and 60 hertz, which is exactly the same as is required for their television standard. In Australia, our turbines spin at 3,000 RPM, which comes down to a nice, neat 50 hertz, and then 50 frames per second. So our television standards, even though they are deeply rooted in what we would call a mode of assertive communication, are actually deeply rooted in the technology behind them. In something as simple as how quickly do you get a turbine to spin? I will eventually move on to energy, but the energy required to fill those fields full of data and then to swap them out for new data every, oh God, 1/60th of a second or 1/50th of a second is massive. We consume a huge amount of electricity. We invest in power plants that supply energy at exactly the right number of oscillations per second, so that we can pull this magic trick off, and so we can have the magic lamp sitting in the corner of our room, flickering images at it at just the right rate, so that we won't notice the flicker in the images and it will be perceived as movement, and will then be perceived as having some kind of meaning in the world, which once again talks back to Tom's point of where does this thing called meaning come from? Where does it reside? I'm not for a moment suggesting that this system generates meaning just because it can flicker images at us fast enough. Something else is at play here. But the fact that it can flicker them at a rate faster than our eyes can perceive, that's a useful kind of thing. Even if certain manufacturers tend to take it a step further than that. All right, I'll fess up to which manufacturers. When Apple first released their iPad, which had what was called a retina display, most screens up to that point in time, particularly those made by Apple, showed a resolution of 72 pixels per inch. That was as good as they got. That was as good as they needed to get. That was the internet. That's the way the world worked, and we were reasonably happy with it. Through their retina display, they could quadruple that. Almost 350 pixels per inch. Incredible level of resolution on each one of these images. The screens themselves refreshed at a rate of up to 150 frames per second. So, like, what we thought of as good quality images were suddenly left in the dust as these incredible displays occurred. Now, the one weird thing about this was, unless you had a raptor, unless you had a wedge-tailed eagle sitting on your shoulder and whispering in your ear going, dude, that's a crackingly good display, you would never know. It's way beyond what human eyes can perceive. So we did it anyway. We took these incredible technological leaps forward, forward, difficult world, simply to impress the crap out of a wedge-tailed eagle. I don't know why. Why would we do such a thing? And on top of that, then, where does all of the energy come from? Every oscillation, every change of state requires an energy to power it, to move it forward. Okay. Now, Herbert A. Simon, in an absolutely crackingly good book called The Sciences of the Artificial, suggested that it was a bad idea to use the methods and methodologies of the hard sciences when trying to explore the creative sciences, and particularly beyond just the creative sciences. Anything that was made by a human being was therefore somewhat artificial in its nature, and using the methods of the hard sciences to explore it was going to be deeply problematic. Now, this was a cracking breakthrough for design research. Suddenly, designers out there had a chance of saying, yeah, you can't bring the methods of the hard sciences to play with us because we do not match the quantity and quality of sort of information you're looking for out of the hard sciences. So using those techniques are problematic, to say the least. So have I just been toying with this? I just did a great nice little walk through why it was we have 25 and 30 frames per second. And no. I'm using some of these hard science terms for their metaphorical value, not for their methodological. I'm actually making here an ontological argument, not a methodological. And yes, those two are connected, but they're not connected in an absolutely straight line. Now, this is Grick's version of the way he sees research occurring. He says, now, I'm not overly fond of this diagram because the arrows in it are actually unidirectional. I would, in my own version of it, flow in both directions. But he suggests that ontology answers the question, what's out there to know? What is actually knowable? And epistemology is what and how can we go about knowing? So this, once again, comes back to Rumsfeld. Yeah. How do we know what we don't know? We have to ask ourselves the deep ontological and epistemological questions every time we approach research. Because once we have a handle on those, it will naturally flow down that we will then have a methodology that suits that logic. And from there, we will have methods. What are we actually doing? What are we doing in the field? What are we doing with our colleagues? What sort of information are we trying to gather? And from that, we'll end up with sources. Now, even Grix says that this diagram is missing the bidirectional arrows. He said, imagine the situation, you're in the library of a university and you manage to come across handwritten notes from someone who appears to be, well, Adolf Hitler, where he's saying in there, you know, maybe the Jews aren't that bad. Maybe it's the Catholics. Maybe I got it wrong. You go, oh dear Lord. Suddenly you have got a source. You have got a source of information. And you now have to backtrack this entire model so that you come back to an ontological position that makes it worthwhile for you to have found this next piece of information. You can't just have a source. It needs to rest on deeper foundations. So even if your source is crackingly good, it's of no use to you unless it actually fits with your ontological and epistemological position. Okay. So did Herbert A. Simon go far enough by getting rid of the hard sciences? No, I don't think he did. I think he would have been far better served to have actually got rid of the laws of economics as well. Just to say, of course, to this day, a lot of our models of creativity, that thing that we would say defines us as human beings, that ability to create, we tend to explain creativity through laws of economics. And that's, to me, is deeply problematic, deeply problematic. And it also leads to the base superstructure model of Marxist and neo-Marxist thought, which has been so deeply ingrained in us that it's actually hard to, it's hard to think of another way of dealing with the world. So there's a classic base superstructure model. Well, superstructure then is everything not to do with production in society. Education, family, religion, politics, media. Whoa. If you have a look at the list of goodies in the top blue box, it's what we call culture. It's what we are. And the base it sits on then is all things needed to produce. Machines, factory, land, raw materials, people's relations to production. Okay. This is a general thought about where energy comes from in a system. In a book that's coming out very soon, I hope, Entrepreneurship in the Creative Industries, and some colleagues and I wrote, we found that the vast majority of people who were successful in the creative industries completely ignored the base superstructure. Completely. As an example, the two men who invented Crossy Roads, the video game, absolutely ignored all of the economic advice for how to run a video game and make money out of it. The easiest way to make money out of it is to allow your players to pay for upgrades, to pay for 5 minutes, yep, to pay for level increases. And both of the people who invented Crossy Roads, the game, are parents. And they went, I don't want that. I would rather my child develop some actual game playing skills and play their way through this game so that they can play well enough to earn an upgrade, not just lash out with some of their parents' dollars. However, as a way of surviving in the creative industries, what would you do? You would obviously want to get access to the parents' dollars. That's the fastest way to make a lot of money out of it, and therefore allow you to keep going and doing what you're doing. In the interview, these two guys said all they wanted to do was make a good game because they knew that there was a paucity of good games out there. So if they could actually make a good game, it would survive against all of the odds. And it did, to the point of making actually a ridiculous amount of money. Okay. Every system that we've talked about here fights against entropy, fights against the loss of order. And now, this is where life gets a bit weird, of course, and it comes back to my mate and his cat. He actually invented a term which was neg entropy or negative entropy. And you would think surely negative entropy is just order, which is what we're all aiming for. I have a suspicion that this was done in the same fashion that negative, well, imaginary numbers were created in mathematics. The square root of -1, for example, doesn't exist unless it turns up in a formula. Unless it turns up when you're working through something, you need to be able to give a value to this object. And that's an imaginary number. And that was exactly what they did. They just created a whole suite of numbers that had never existed before, and called them imaginary and gave them a little I to indicate that they were imaginary. But they were useful in being able to work through particular equations and come out with a real concrete answer at the end. But it was only by going through imaginary numbers to get there. Negative entropy and Schrodinger, I suspect it was exactly that problem. He had examples of entropy in emergent systems where the only way he could actually solve the equation was developing negative values for entropy. And that's what actually drove the requirement for it. So just like imaginary numbers, this is an example of a model of creativity. Csikszentmihalyi's model reimagined by Susan Kerrigan. The reason I like this model in particular is because it actually puts creative practice right. It isn't a creative product. It isn't a poem. It isn't a song. It isn't a play that comes out of this model. It's creative practice. So that's a much bigger object than one creative output. But check out these words around it, which all have verbs in there. Selects novelty, transmits novelty, stimulates novelty. What provides the energy for that? That's my first big question. The one that's been annoying me all of my life ever since I saw this model and fell in love with it. Because it did all of the right things. It decentered the individual. It took the individual out of the creative process. It allowed for there being a system at work where the system was much more important than the individual. And the internalization of that system was even more important than the individual. But it had all of these verbs running around. And I went, okay, what powered those verbs? What gives them the impetus? What is the, 3,000 RPM transformer that actually makes this system work? What is that thing? And this is where I think it becomes a question of MetaModernism. Whatever the form of energy is, it has to work at the individual level. But it also has to be strong enough to work at the societal and the cultural level. Because this is a system that implicates all of those levels of creative practice into one model. Now, this is where I get a bit cheeky. Maybe it's an activity designed to reduce existential angst. Something designed to make existence more meaningful for us. And that will never be earning another $2.50 a week. So the base superstructure model certainly does not work in this. Getting rid of some existential angst would probably work for all of us. That seems to me to be the one source of energy which is an anthropological constant. Okay, thank you all very much. I apologise for running a bit long.
Right? You don't think real estate is good?
No, can't be.